She thought the blue light of her phone was a lifeline until she realized she had dialed the devil. Zahara Quinn spent 3 years building a fortress around her heart to keep the shadows of her past at bay. But when her abusive ex-fiancé, Marcus Red, tracked her halfway across the globe to a hotel in Seoul, that fortress began to crumble. With the sound of his heavy boots echoing in the corridor of room 1207, she sent a frantic text meant for the front desk, a plea for a security guard to stop the man at her door. Instead, a 1-digit error sent her message straight into the obsidian penthouse above, landing in the hands of Baek Ji-hoon, the notorious Dragon of the North. While Marcus pounded on her door, the city's most feared Mafia boss was already staring at his screen, intrigued by the fire in her desperate words. He didn't send a guard. He sent his most ruthless enforcer with a simple, chilling command: stay inside. Zahara had invited a monster to save her from a ghost, never realizing that the man who answered her text had been watching the shadows for a reason of his own. The heavy, rhythmic thud of leather soles against the hallway carpet was a sound Zahara Quinn could identify in her sleep. It was a predatory stride, deliberate and heavy with the promise of a confrontation she had traveled 6,000 miles to avoid. Pressed against the cold mahogany of the door to room 1207, she held her breath until her lungs burned. Then came the voice, smooth, polished, and terrifyingly familiar. "I know you're in there, Z," Marcus Red called out, his tone dripping with the kind of forced patience that always preceded a storm. "Seoul is a small city for someone with your tastes. Did you really think a change of scenery would change the fact that you belong to me?" Zahara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of silk and nerves. She bit her finger to stifle a sob, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on the handle as it began to jiggle. He wasn't just knocking, he was testing the strength of the lock. Her trembling hands fumbled with her smartphone, the blue light of the screen illuminating her pale face in the darkened foyer. She couldn't call for help, the mere sound of her voice would ignite him. She opened a message thread, her vision blurred by hot, stinging tears. She needed the front desk. She needed Tessa Lang, or anyone with a radio and a badge. "Room 1207, don't let him in," she typed, her thumbs shaking so violently that the letters danced across the glass. She didn't check the contact. She didn't verify the string of digits she had scrambled to memorize from the hotel's bedside placard. She hit send, the whoosh of the departing message sounding like a final gasp of hope. Outside, the handle turned sharply, stopped only by the deadbolt. "Z, don't make me get the manager," Marcus warned, his voice dropping an octave into a low, jagged threat. "Open this door, or I promise you, the scene I cause will be the end of that quiet life you're trying to build." Zahara slid down the wall, clutching the phone to her chest as if it were a shield. She waited for the buzz of a reply, for the confirmation that security was on their way. When the phone finally vibrated, she snatched it up, her heart stopping at the sight of the unfamiliar contact. It wasn't the front desk. The reply was 4 words long, stripped of comfort, and heavy with an authority that made the air in the room feel suddenly, impossibly thick. "Wrong number. Stay inside." In the penthouse above, the Dragon of the North stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the message glowing in his palm. Baek Ji-hoon didn't care for accidents, but as he heard the muffled shouting from the floor below, his intense gaze shifted toward the door. He had been looking for a reason to remind the city who truly owned the shadows, and the woman in 1207 had just given him the key. Baek Ji-hoon stood in the silent expanse of the Grand Seoul's penthouse, the city's skyline bleeding neon through the floor-to-ceiling glass. In his world, silence was a luxury bought with blood, yet it was shattered by a single, sharp vibration from the smartphone in his palm. He looked down at the screen, expecting a report from the docks or a briefing on the nervous board members he was systematically dismantling. Instead, he saw a message that shouldn't have reached him. "Room 1207. Don't let him in." Ji-hoon's thumb hovered over the delete key, his initial instinct to discard the error like a faulty shipment. But he paused, his intense, focused gaze narrowing as he read the words again. There was an unfiltered desperation in the text, a raw fire that cut through the sterile atmosphere of his evening. Most people spent their lives trying to keep their secrets from him. This woman had handed him her terror by accident. He glanced at the security monitors on the wall. The feed for the 12th floor showed a man aggressive, pacing, and clearly unwanted pounding on the door of 1207. Ji-hoon recognized the type. A man who mistook possession for power. It was a trait he loathed. His curiosity, usually reserved for complex market shifts and rival movements, was piqued by the stranger's plea. She hadn't asked for a hero, she had asked for a barrier. Beside him, Lee Jae-min stirred, the enforcer's stoic presence shifting in the shadows like a panther ready to strike. Jae-min waited for the command to ignore it, to let the hotel's mediocre security handle the domestic disturbance. But Ji-hoon was already typing, his fingers steady as he formulated a response that was as much a test as it was a warning. Wrong number. Stay inside. He sent, his voice low as he addressed the empty room. She's either the luckiest woman in Seoul or the most cursed. The thrill of the unknown, a sensation Ji-hoon hadn't felt in years, rippled through him. He wasn't a man of coincidences. If the universe had dropped this woman's life into his lap, he was going to see exactly what she was worth. He signaled to Jae-min, a sharp, clinical tilt of his head toward the elevator. The death god of Seoul had just accepted a contract he hadn't been looking for, and he was curious to see if the girl in 1207 was strong enough to survive the rescue. Inside room 1207, the world had shrunk to the size of a doorway. Zahara remained collapsed against the wall, her breath hitching in shallow, jagged gasps. Outside, the aggression had reached a fever pitch. Marcus was no longer just turning the handle. He was throwing his weight against the wood, the frame groaning under the assault. "Open the door, Zahara. I'm not leaving until you realize how much you need me." His voice roared, distorted by rage. Then, abruptly, the violence stopped. The silence that followed was not the peaceful kind. It was heavy, vacuum-like, and sudden. Zahara strained her ears, expecting the sound of a struggle or a shout, but there was only a chilling void where Marcus's threats had been. A moment later, two sharp rhythmic raps sounded against the wood, not the frantic pounding of a predator, but the clinical measured knock of a professional. "Miss Quinn?" A voice called out, low and devoid of emotion. "The hallway is clear. Open the door." Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her phone. She didn't recognize the voice, but it possessed a terrifying calm that felt like a command from a higher power. Slowly, her knees trembling, Zahara stood and disengaged the deadbolt. As the door swung open, she didn't see Marcus. He was gone, as if he had been erased from existence. In his place stood a man who looked like a shadow carved into human form. Lee Jae-min did not smile. His stoic expression was unreadable, his dark clothing blending into the dim lighting of the hotel corridor. Behind him, two other men in suits stood like pillars, their presence radiating a quiet, lethal efficiency. "Where is he?" Zahara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jae-min didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, gesturing toward the elevators. "He is no longer a concern for the evening. My employer is waiting for you. It is time to leave." I can't just leave," she stammered, looking back at her scattered luggage. "You can stay here and wait for him to return with reinforcements," Jae-min stated, his gaze level and piercing. "Or you can come with us. The choice is yours, but the window of safety is closing." Zahara looked down at her phone, at the 4 words from a stranger that had somehow silenced her nightmare. Fear of the unknown fought with the terror she already knew. Realizing she was choosing between a ghost and a dragon, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the hall. Jae-min led her through the service corridors, bypassing the lobby and the staring eyes of the hotel staff. Within minutes, She was being ushered into the back of a sleek, black sedan. As the car pulled away from the curb and vanished into the neon-soaked arteries of Seoul, Zahara looked back at the hotel. Room 1207 was a dark square in a sea of lights, a prison she had finally escaped only to be driven deeper into the heart of a kingdom she didn't understand. The black sedan moved through the city like a silent blade, the neon blur of Seoul eventually giving way to the jagged silhouettes of the mountains. Zahara must have succumbed to the adrenaline crash, because when her eyes finally fluttered open, the cramped terror of room 1207 had been replaced by a vast, suffocating luxury. She was lying on a chaise longue in a room that felt more like a museum than a home, surrounded by walls of obsidian glass and cold, polished marble. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching storm. As her senses returned, so did the memory of the text, the wrong number that had silenced Marcus. "You're awake," a voice resonated through the room, low and steady as a heartbeat. Zahara bolted upright, her fingers digging into the velvet upholstery. Standing by a massive floor-to-ceiling window was the man from the penthouse. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the dim light, his dark hair styled in a sharp, impeccable pompadour. He didn't look like a hotel guest. He looked like the owner of the world. He turned slowly, his stern, intense gaze locking onto hers with a focus that made her feel completely exposed. This was Baek Ji-hoon. He held a smartphone in one hand, the device that had received her desperate plea. I should go." Zahara stammered, her voice brittle. "I need to find a different hotel. I'll pay you for the ride, for the help." "You'll pay me?" Ji-hoon's lips didn't move into a smile, but his eyes flashed with a dark, clinical amusement. He stepped toward her, his presence engulfing the space. "You sent a distress signal to the private line of a man who doesn't believe in charity, Miss Quinn. In my world, when I intervene, I own the outcome." Zahara looked toward the door, but Lee Jae-min stood there like a stone gargoyle, his expression unreadable. She was no longer being hunted in a hallway, but she was far from free. She had traded a predator she understood for a god she didn't. "Why didn't you just call the police?" she whispered, her wide eyes searching his face for a flicker of humanity. "Because the police would have asked you questions you aren't ready to answer," Ji-hoon replied. Stopping just inches from her, he leaned down, his scent of tobacco and cedar enveloping her. "And because I wanted to see the woman who was brave enough to text a monster to save her from a coward." He held up the phone, the screen still displaying her message. "Room 1207. Don't let him in. You're safe here," he said, his voice dropping to a possessive hum. "But safety in this house has a price. You wanted him out, he's out. Now, you belong to the shadows that kept him away." The silence of the obsidian suite was heavy, broken only by the distant roll of thunder echoing off the mountains. Zahara sat frozen on the chaise, the weight of Ji-hoon's gaze feeling more restrictive than the walls of the hotel room she had fled. She had expected a demand for money or perhaps a cold dismissal. She hadn't expected the man who ruled the city to be holding a dossier on her life. Ji-hoon walked back to a sleek, mahogany desk and picked up a tablet, his movements precise and predatory. "You think you are here because you made a mistake with a keypad, Zahara," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the marble floor. "But Marcus Red didn't follow you to Seoul just to beg for a second chance. He came here to sell what remains of you." He slid the tablet across the table. Zahara's breath hitched as she saw digital blueprints of her most intricate jewelry designs, pieces she hadn't even released yet, interspersed with bank ledgers and encrypted chat logs. "He's been shopping your proprietary techniques to the Kang Syndicate," Ji-hoon continued, his eyes narrowing into flinty slivers. "Your ex-fiancé didn't just want your heart, he wanted your legacy. He's already taken a down payment to hand over your latest collection to a factory in Gyeonggi." The room seemed to tilt. The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than the fear she had felt in the hallway. Marcus hadn't just been stalking her, he had been cannibalizing her future to pay off his own mounting debts. "Why do you care about my designs?" Zahara whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. "I don't care about the gold," Jihoon replied, stepping back into her personal space, his shadow engulfing her. "I care about the fact that the Kangs are using your work to launder their dirty capital." By stepping into room 1207, Marcus brought a war to my doorstep. And by texting me, you became the only witness who can dismantle their supply chain. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a dark, possessive tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine. "You aren't a guest, and you aren't a victim. You are the collateral in a debt of protection." Zahara looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his stern, focused face. She realized then that the monster hadn't just saved her from a coward, he had intercepted a transaction. She was no longer a woman in hiding. She was a piece on a chessboard she didn't know how to play. "What happens if I refuse to help you?" she asked. Jihoon's expression didn't soften. "Then Marcus finds you, and the Kangs get their designs." "I simply stop standing in their way." He leaned closer, his scent of sandalwood and cold rain overwhelming her. "But I think you've had enough of men who take from you. Stay with me, and I will make sure there is nothing left of Marcus Red to fear." The sun rose over Seoul not with a celebratory glow, but with a sharp, clinical light that filtered through the reinforced glass of Jihoon's estate. Zahara followed the silent, towering presence of Lee Jae-min down a corridor she hadn't seen before, her footsteps muffled by silk-threaded rugs. When the enforcer finally opened a set of heavy double doors, the breath left her lungs. It wasn't a room, it was a sanctuary. The space was flooded with natural light, equipped with state-of-the-art jeweler's benches, high-precision casting equipment, and a vault containing raw gemstones that shimmered like captured stars. In the center of the room stood Jihoon, his back to her, as he examined a sketch she had made years ago, one Marcus had claimed was lost. "A diamond is only a rock until it endures enough pressure to find its clarity," Jihoon said, turning to face her. His expression remained stern, but his gaze held a new, vibrating intensity. "I do not expect you to hide here, Zahara. I expect you to reclaim what was stolen." Zahara walked to the primary bench, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool steel of a precision graver. For months, she had felt like a ghost, but the familiar weight of the tools grounded her. She looked up at him, her wide eyes narrowing with a spark of the defiance that had been buried under years of Marcus's shadows. "You're giving me a cage with better views, Jihoon. Why?" "Because the Kangs think you are a broken tool they can exploit," he replied, moving closer until the heat of his presence was a physical weight. "I want them to see that you are the architect of their downfall. Every piece you create here will be a signature of my protection and your power." As the days bled into a week, the dynamic between them shifted from captor and prisoner to something far more dangerous. Jihoon began to spend his late nights in the corner of the studio, watching her work in a silence that felt like a conversation. He watched her handle a torch with surgical precision, her face illuminated by the blue flame, her brow furrowed in a focus that made him forget the ledgers and the blood on his own hands. He had expected a victim who needed a shield. Instead, he found a woman who carved beauty out of chaos. One evening, as she struggled with a complex platinum setting, he reached out, his large, tattooed hand steadying her wrist. The contact was electric, a jolt of raw connection that made her pulse thunder. "You aren't what I expected," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, possessive hum. "And what was that?" Zahara asked, her breath hitching as she looked up into his deep, fathomless eyes. "Disposable?" Jihoon admitted, his thumb brushing the pulse point at her neck. "But you are a diamond, Zahara. And I find myself wanting to see just how much light you can reflect before the world tries to dim you again." The peace of the studio shattered with the harsh, rhythmic vibration of Jihoon's phone against the mahogany workbench. Zahara looked up from a half-set sapphire, the torch's blue flame casting long, dancing shadows against her face. She saw the shift in Ji-hoon instantly. The dark tenderness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, obsidian void as he stared at the screen. Without a word, he turned the tablet toward her. The screen was a chaotic mosaic of graining, high-zoom photographs. There she was, caught in a telephoto lens stepping out of the sedan, a silhouette in the estate's garden, and most damningly, a shot through the studio glass where Ji-hoon's hand rested near her neck. The headlines in the Seoul tabloids were already screaming about the dragon's secret muse, but the underlying message was for a different audience. "The Kangs," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating hum. "They didn't just want the designs. They wanted to see if I had developed a weakness. By leaking these, they've forced a public play. They are telling the world that if they can see you, they can touch you." The blood drained from Zahara's face. The feeling of being watched, the phantom sensation of a camera lens like a sniper's scope, made her skin crawl. But the terror reached its zenith when a second notification flashed a grainy video feed from the estate's perimeter gate. A fleet of black SUVs had crested the mountain road, blocking the only exit. Stepping out of the lead vehicle was a man who looked revitalized by malice. Marcus Red wasn't cowering in a hallway anymore. He stood flanked by a dozen professional mercenaries, their tactical gear a grim contrast to the elegant grounds. He looked directly into the security camera and smiled, holding up a legal document that was surely a fabrication, but a loud enough one to justify his presence to the local authorities. "He's back," Zahara whispered, her hand instinctively finding the hilt of a carving tool. "And he's not alone. He's a scavenger," Ji-hoon growled, his jaw set in a line of terrifying stillness. He didn't look at the gates. He looked at Zahara, his large hand cupping her cheek one last time before his fingers curled into a fist. He thinks the Kang's backing makes him a king. He doesn't realize he's just brought the lambs to the altar. Ji-hoon signaled to Lee Jae-min, who appeared in the doorway, already checking the slide on his sidearm. The air in the room grew heavy with the scent of ozone and the weight of an impending slaughter. Zahara realized then that the him at the door had returned with an army, but she was no longer the girl trembling in room 1207. She stood tall in the center of the dragon's lair, watching as the man she had accidentally texted prepared to burn the world down to keep her in the light. The Grand Seoul Ballroom was a masterpiece of lethal elegance, a sea of shimmering silk and whispered conspiracies. Zahara stood at the center of the fray, her skin glowing against a gown of molten gold. The dragon's muse necklace resting heavily against her collarbone, a signature of both her genius and her protection. Beside her, Ji-hoon moved with the predatory grace of a man who had already won, his hand a steady, warm weight on the small of her back. The air turned frigid as the heavy doors swung open, admitting the one ghost Zahara thought she had buried. Marcus Red entered with the frantic arrogance of a man who believed his borrowed power was absolute. He ignored the glinting eyes of the city's elite, his gaze fixed solely on Zahara with a possessive, ugly heat. "The charade is over, Zahara," Marcus announced, his voice echoing with a jagged, desperate edge. He stepped toward her, flanked by the Kang Syndicate's legal shadows, his fingers twitching toward the gold on her neck. "You belong back in the States, and these designs belong to the people who paid for them. Don't make me remind you of what happens when you say no to me." Zahara didn't flinch. She felt the heat of Ji-hoon's presence, but for the first time, she didn't lean into it for cover. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with a clarity that made Marcus falter. "I am not the woman you trapped in room 1207, Marcus," she said, her voice a low, resonant blade that cut through the silence of the ballroom. "You didn't sell my designs. You sold your own execution. Every stone in this room knows exactly who you are, a thief trying to play a king's game." Marcus's face contorted into a mask of rage, but before he could bridge the gap, the lights flickered and the room's massive screens surged to life. Ji-hoon hadn't been watching the confrontation. He had been orchestrating a dismantling. The screens displayed a live stream of the Kang Syndicate's offshore accounts being drained to zero, alongside encrypted chat logs of Marcus's betrayal. "You brought a knife to a war of gods." Ji-hoon's voice vibrated through the floorboards, cold and final. He signaled to Lee Jae-min, who emerged from the shadows like a reaper. As the security detail swarmed Marcus and his benefactors, the him at the door finally understood the weight of the man Zahara had texted. Zahara watched Marcus being dragged into the night, his screams fading into the neon-soaked wind of Seoul. She turned to Ji-hoon, the fire in her eyes matching the dragon on his neck. The debt was paid, the shadows were gone, and the muse was finally ready to rule her own empire. The morning after the gala, the penthouse was bathed in a quiet golden light that felt earned. The frantic energy of the night before had settled into a profound, weighted peace. Zahara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city of Seoul, which no longer felt like a labyrinth of hiding places. For the first time in years, the air she breathed didn't taste like fear. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out her old smartphone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of glass spanning across the message thread that had changed her life. She scrolled past the frantic Room 1207 plea and found Marcus's contact information. Her thumb hovered over the delete button. There was no hesitation this time, no lingering shadow of what if, or the paralyzing learned helplessness that had once defined her. With a single tap, his name, his number, and his hold over her existence were erased. She watched the contact vanish into the digital void, a ghost finally laid to rest. A soft click of leather on marble announced Ji-hoon's arrival. He didn't hover. He simply stepped into her space, his presence as grounding as a mountain. He didn't ask if she was all right. He already knew she was more than all right. She was reborn. He reached out and gently took the old, damaged device from her hand, setting it aside on a marble console like a piece of discarded scrap. In its place, he pressed a new device into her palm. It was sleek, custom-built, and heavy with the weight of a different kind of promise. "A new beginning requires a clean slate," Ji-hoon murmured, his low baritone vibrating against the quiet of the room. "The world can no longer reach you unless you allow it." Zahara powered on the screen. There were no social media apps, no cluttered notifications, and no history of a woman in hiding. She opened the contact list. There was only one entry, labeled not with a title or a warning, but simply with his name. "You'll find that this line is private," Ji-hoon said, his thumb brushing the back of her hand with a dark, possessive tenderness. "It doesn't go to a front desk or a security detail. It comes only to me." Zahara looked up into his deep, fathomless eyes, seeing the man who had turned a wrong digit into a destiny. She didn't feel like a prisoner in a gilded cage anymore. She felt like a queen who had finally moved to her true address. She tucked the phone away and leaned into him, the dragon of the north and his muse finally standing together in the light. She was no longer the girl in room 1207. She was exactly where she was meant to be,